Hello, my name is Leah Shulman, and I will be talking about the dioxin release disaster in Seveso, Italy. So in this presentation, we'll be talking about the history of dioxin, what caused the dioxin explosion, the health consequences, and the aftermath and effects. This will be the table of contents of what we'll be going over. To begin, the history of dioxin is that, including TCDD, they are byproducts of various industrial processes such as waste, incineration, paper, and pulp, and bleaching. Also, to note, prior to the Seveso accident in 1976, not much was known about the toxicity of dioxins in humans. Most information came from animal studies and a few small occupational exposure studies as well. TCDD was a contaminant Agent Orange, an herbicide used during the Vietnam War, which led to exposure of Vietnam residents and American troops. Major human exposure incidents, such as the Seveso accident in 1976 and Japan and in Taiwan, cooking oil and contamination incidents provided additional data on the dioxin toxicity in humans themselves. Since then, these incidents of toxicology in dioxins has been well studied. Dioxins are known to exert their toxic effects primarily through binding to receptors, which disrupt the various cellular process. In 1997, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified TCDD as a human carcinogen. Today, most human exposure in dioxins occur through diet, particularly fatty foods like dairy, meat, and fish, and these compounds bioaccumulate in the food chain. However, exposure levels have declined over recent decades due to efforts to reduce dioxin emissions. Timeline of events. July 10th, 1976. An explosion occurred at a chemical factory in Mita, Italy, which is near Seveso. A plume containing dioxins, mainly TCDD, was released and dispersed over an 18-kilometer squared area. In the days following the explosion, residents were exposed to the plume, experienced symptoms like headaches, nausea, eye irritation. The presence of dioxin was not confirmed until 10 days after the accident. July 26th to August 2nd, 1976, 16 to 26 days after the explosion, residents in most of the contaminated area, Zone A, were evacuated. In the weeks and months after, blood samples were collected from thousands of residents, and by April 1977, 100 cases of chloresine were documented, 88% of children. Chloresine lesions regressed over 2 years in most cases. In the 1980s, technology became available, to measure the TCDD levels and store blood samples. Longitudinal health studies were conducted using health registries of victims. Continued today, increased incidence of certain cancer, diabetes, and other health effects were found sometime decades later. The contaminated Zone A was eventually turned into a park. These are examples of during the incident cleanup, unfortunately what chloresine looked like on children, and images of livestock dying from exposure. So first, we're going to start off by understanding how much spread. As mentioned, the Zone A, there was a range of soil that gained from 15 to 5,000, and it lessens as you move out to Zone B and into Zone R. Exposure risks. Based on the areas affected, we're able to, of the contaminated zones in the Seveso area, by considering, as we saw on this map, all the areas combined between Zone A and Zone B and exclusion to Zone R, we see that of which areas were most affected. Number of people affected, which is individual contamination by risks. Zone A was 2%, while zone B, 12%, zone R making up 84.5% of the overall contamination risks. Animal exposure. The fate of animals in zones A, B, and R, as documented between small animals, cattle, horses and donkeys, swine, and sheep and goats, it was noticed to see that the small animals were the most heavily impacted. And this was note of the animals that were existing prior to the incident and how many animals were documented to die naturally after the incident. Many of the animals were prophylactically taken under as well. Lastly, death and mortality outcomes. The cause of death in the ICD-9 classification, these are just some of the many different causes of death. Overall, you can see that there are increases in diabetes, circulatory disease, in hypertension. There was increases in cancer, digestive disease as well. And overall, there was a higher rate of impact on both men and women and in different varying degrees of types of diseases. Response. In response to the disaster, the following changes were made. Changes in regulation. Companies were required to create plans for responding to emergencies and provide local communities with safety information. Emergency response plans were for chemical spills and other incidents became required, and also to train employees on how to respond. Safety measurement systems were being put in place on how to identify hazards, assess risks, and control and the implementation are all part of the prevention. And of course, process safety management, which is the systems in which focus on preventing incidents during the production, like handling, storing hazardous chemicals, and all of this were occurred because of the incident. In conclusion, the Seveso disaster was a terrifying event that had significant consequences for both the chemical industry and people who have resided in the surrounding areas. The release of dioxin can have a tremendous impact on health and safety of individuals and further